All right.
Hello there.
Hi, how are you?
Good, how are you doing?
I'm doing well, thank you. My birthday's tomorrow.
We're doing the second interview for Brief Black Candles,
Yes.
which is your book that came out. What month did it come out?
In November. November the
Your,
11th. Yeah.
this is the book for anyone who hasn't seen it. And if you are interested in buying it, you can find it on your website, which is,
Literaryink.com, and that's LYDERARYINK.com.
and if you can, you should buy the book at King's Books in Tacoma or your local independent bookstore. Um, okay, so if you don't have anything, I'll just jump right in with the questions I prepared.
Sounds good.
Okay, as I said before, this is our second interview. So if you haven't had the chance to watch the first interview, please do that. We're sort of going to be building off some of the things that we talked about in the first interview with this interview. So in our last interview, we talked about a lot of the themes that you brought up in Brief Black Candles, some of which were blackness, what it's like to be a woman in America or a black woman in America.
Hmm.
Something that we brushed past, really, which I didn't notice until I was rewatching the interview, was queerness.
Okay.
So the question that I want to present to you is, do you think that Brief Black Candles is inherently a queer work, or do you feel like you had to make an intentional effort to imbue queerness into the narrative?
Oh, that's a good question. And it's interesting that you asked that because on Amazon when it first came out, it was listed as Black African American poetry, and then in
Mm,
subsequent days and weeks, it became listed as queer poetry.
mm,
And
mhm,
I didn't make it intentionally queer or anything
mm,
like that. Um, I just wrote from, from my perspective, and obviously, um, queerness is a part of my perspective,
mm,
and being an LGBTQ um, person and ally. And so some of the poetry makes indicates relationships that are same
yeah.
gender, and you know, and so it just went from there.
So you feel like it's more inherent because you as an artist are queer, so whatever perspective you bring is inherently queer.
Yes, you
That's what
said
you're
it much
saying.
better than than I did,
No,
but
just
yes.
just
Yeah.
I just wanted to make sure that I was representing and taking away exactly what you meant.
Yeah, I found it really interesting though that the classification switched,
Yeah.
that it went away from being listed as Black poetry and went to, into lesbian and queer
So
poetry.
so just to be clear, it's listed as queer poetry, not queer black poetry?
No, no, not on the
Huh.
not on Amazon where I was looking, I
Okay.
haven't but it was a marked difference. Like all of a
Yeah.
sudden Black just went away. And I was curious about that. And I even like logged onto their author portal and tried to figure out. I mean, I'm not good at any of that kind of stuff. So I just sent a note about it.
Yeah.
And I didn't hear back, but
That's really
whatever.
fascinating.
Yeah, I don't know who makes those classifications
Sure.
and what they saw that made it more one over the other, but
Yeah.
I found it very interesting.
Huh. That is interesting. That could be a whole thing in and of itself.
Yeah, for
Um,
sure.
But on a related note, again, this is our second interview. So in our last interview, we talked about the most primary theme in the book, which is blackness, and
Mhm.
many of the other themes that go along with that, which is black life, death, motherhood, pain, especially pain specific to the American context and generational trauma. But something that we didn't really talk about, which goes along with historicity and the continuation of legacy,
Mhm.
is sexuality
Mhm.
and its role in the present, the past, and the future. So I wanted to see if you had any thoughts about the role of sexuality as a theme in the book.
That's a good question. I think I'm a little bit of a dork, a nerd. I look away at love scenes in movies. My friend Matthew teases me about that all the time. Um, and so I feel like I don't write explicitly about sexuality,
Yeah.
but I do. There are allusions to that, to
Yeah.
romantic love, to physicality, um, and it's just not in my wheelhouse to
Sure.
be super explicit. I mean, I Matthew had actually challenged me. We write together and give each other prompts and things and challenges, and he challenged me to write an explicit poem,
Sure.
and I never really got around to it. I think the closest that I came was there's a poem called Bear.
Yeah.
Um and the Bear and then maybe As I Leave. Those are the
Mm.
two. They're just like little jots in
Yeah.
reference to sexuality.
One I noticed actually was "A Breath Away," which
Mhm.
which has the lines, "Patient pathways with love's swollen berry promise,"
Mhm.
and again, that is very it's an illusion.
Mhm.
It's very figurative language, but that is the one that made me write down the question because I began to see the consistent theme.
Mhm.
Um, but in our last interview, you said you felt like this book represented about 90% of you
Mhm.
because you felt like it didn't necessarily go into the autistic perspective or
Mhm.
the parts of your life that you would say your autism rub up against. But something I noticed, and please correct me if I'm wrong because I'm not an expert on living with the autistic perspective, but something I noticed is that um, the way that you talk about sexuality, and even just now you talked about how you're a little bit more like look away or lighthearted with the subject and have a hard time being explicit with it. Do you feel like the way that you talk about certain things, especially with sexuality, does show that it's
Hmm.
coming from a person with an autistic perspective?
Wow, I think that could definitely be it because it's such a big it's like there's a I don't know if parable is the right word, but it talks about two fish swimming along and an older fish swims by and says, "How's the water?" And the two young fish look at each other and they're like, "What's water?"
Sure.
Because because when
Mm,
you're in it and you're immersed in it, you don't really realize. And there are so many times when I'll say something and then someone points out kind of the autismness of it.
yes.
And I'm like, "Oh, yeah, that is like I totally wouldn't have realized that my response to that was an autistic response."
Yeah.
But growing up, I was much I would say the traits of autism were so much more prevalent when I was younger in ways that I've outgrown or have found strategies to work through. So when I was
Sure.
younger, I couldn't stand for people to touch me. I did not like people to touch me at all. It just physically it wasn't revolting or anything like that, but it made me extremely uncomfortable.
Hmm.
Um and I really had a hard time with it. And in my romantic life, it takes a while for me to be comfortable enough to have a close physical relationship with people. I mean, now, like, I used to not be able to hug people, or I really hated it. I
Yeah.
still don't really like shaking hands.
Yeah.
Passing the peace in church, like, is something I try to avoid so
Sure. Yeah.
drastically. Um, and so I've come a long way, and I don't think I come across as very strange or that is unnatural for me, but I think that possibly could be it. Like if we're watching something and there is a love scene, it doesn't bother me, but it is so out of context for me. And
Sure.
context is so important for me because of my autism, I think.
Yeah.
And it's out of context for me to react, and I'm like, I'm just sitting here watching a movie. Like I don't need to be in that moment. And
Yeah.
so it does cause me to kind of step away from it a little bit. And then when it's over, I just go back to watching the movie. It's private,
Yeah.
So I don't need to be in that person's private experience, even though it's a movie or something like that, or a book where I skim over, you know, those types of scenes.
Yeah, and I just tended to get the sense. This is something that you say. You describe yourself often as a seventh grader, and your terms of your sense of humor, like the kind of things that would make a seventh grader laugh, which sex in a movie definitely would, is something that you often say would also make you laugh, or
Yeah,
like a
I'm just
fart
like, oh.
joke or something would make you laugh or something.
Yeah.
And so yeah, and so when I was reading the book, I read the book again today. I watched the first interview today, and I just noticed that the way that you spoke about sexuality was very oftentimes not in sexually explicit terms,
Hmm.
even though it was clear what you were talking about.
Yeah.
So I just thought like, oh, well maybe that is an area of the book that shows that
Hmm.
you are a person with autism.
Yeah.
Although, of course, autistic people aren't a microcosm, so I'm
Right.
sure that there are plenty of autistic writers who might write sexually explicit things
Yeah.
all the
Yeah.
time. But
It's
I
so,
just wanted to hear what you had to say about that.
that is so funny because, and probably because I have always taught middle schoolers. I was a middle school teacher for over 20 years,
Yeah.
and so I do laugh at that. Like, my brother burped the other day, and it just cracked me up, and I just was laughing so hard. It's just so ridiculous. And my sister, Reese, she was like, "Gosh, you're such a middle schooler," and
Yeah.
it is funny because maybe that is just an autistic aspect of me. Like, I react to stuff. It's just hilarious to me, and so it's so ridiculous. But I'm like, I have no answer for it, and I'm not gonna apologize for it because it makes me laugh, and that's it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So thank you for answering that because that was something I was really curious about.
Yeah.
Um, so on page 37 of the hard copy,
Mhm.
road stories is
Yeah.
is there.
Mhm.
And Road Stories is split into three parts, each of them telling a little bit of a different story, although they do seem like they are related. So I was wondering
Yes.
what connects them.
That's a great question. So Jinya, it says road stories for Jinya.
Yeah.
She was a young woman that I met during a summer at Bredlow School of English in Middlebury, through Middlebury College in the Green Mountains of Vermont. And if you ever get a chance to go there, writers, English people, go. It's like English nerd camp. It's the best. And part of you're so remote. Even there was one place in a field we had to stand to get Wi-Fi signal.
Hmm.
And so the nature is beautiful, of course, and there is a 6 mile Robert Frost trail
Mm.
that we would walk every morning. We would do the loop, and along the trail, you would find Robert Frost poetry along at random spots, like on a bench or on a rock or something. And I believe it's across from, either that was a part of his land, but I know it was across from a cabin that he used to spend lots of time and write in, that he gave to the college. Um, so Jenya was one of my close friends during that summer, and every morning she and I and my other friend Nicole, we would go on walks. And these road stories comes from the conversations that we had during that time. And she had traveled a lot. She had just come from a semester in Vermont. She's from the Ukraine, and she was planning to. She and her fiance were going to get married, and they were moving to Beijing afterwards. And her story was so interesting because, and she was so young and so innocent, and English was not her first language. So the way that our conversations were just direct and blunt, and I love that because that's the
Mm.
type of person I am.
Yeah.
And I'll never forget when she asked me, "Why is your small child white?"
Hmm.
Because she didn't, because Matt did look just white from
Yeah.
her perspective. She didn't have a lot of experience with mixed race people. And when I explained it to her, it just really resonated with her because even though her parents were both Ukrainian, her mom came from a different ethnicity, and that her father's parents would not accept. And
Yeah.
so we talked a lot about that, because your dad's family didn't really ever accept me.
Yeah.
And there, and so each of the three sections deals with a different theme that came up in our conversations. And I
Mm.
think that people can connect with
Yeah.
through different parts of their lives and experiences. But I wanted to keep it together because they were all related to that time, that experience, and that young woman,
Yeah.
even though thematically they were quite a bit different.
Yeah. That makes a lot of sense. I really like that. The fact that it had a dedication made me think that it was probably something like that.
Hmm.
But I'm glad that you told that story because now people get to know.
Yeah.
I didn't even know, so that's very helpful. So on page 53 of the hard copy, um, school board meeting
Ooh.
is on there. And I honestly, rereading this, I cannot believe that we got through an hour-long interview without even talking about school board meeting. It slipped right past my mind, and it's so powerful. So what I noticed is in the poem you talk about sly coded bigotry, basically dog whistling, that some people slip into conversation and then
Hmm.
kind of gaslight you when you try to call it out, saying, well, let me just go to the poem because you say it very well. And then they will tell you that you are seeing an illusion, um, instead of reality,
Hmm.
when they're the ones who are slipping in that racism very slyly so that when you call it out, you look crazy. In the poem, here's the question. In the poem, you use quotations throughout the whole thing, and it seems like you're quoting something or someone. Is this something that directly happened to you? Are you quoting a different TV show or movie? Let me know.
So this is something that really happened.
Wow.
There was a call that was put out um for people who, supported trans rights, and who we have been actively working against the bathroom bill
Mm,
that was being pushed. And there was a call to those of us who have been working together for a couple of years,
yeah,
because this school board was having a meeting specifically about the rights of trans youth to be able to use the appropriate bathroom for their gender identity.
sure.
And there was a group of people who were behind the bill who were apparently going to be showing up at the meeting. And so we wanted to, it wasn't my district, it was kind of pretty far, but I was like, I have to go and
Sure.
stand.
Yeah.
um and I wish I had taken a notebook, so I could have written down uh a lot of the notes, but as it was, I just wrote my thoughts on the program, or the sheet that was saying what the schedule was. And as someone, I don't know if he was a parent or if he was someone who was there because he supported the bathroom bill, he was speaking, and those quotes are from this gentleman who stood and spoke. And it it was hard, every
Mm,
time that we went to stand and give true information about the bathroom bill, when there were people who were saying, this is going to allow perverts to go into your bathroom, and like all of this false narrative.
mm,
um but we have to do that, we have to be come down on the right side of people,
yeah.
to have, and children to have their rights. Um and it it's not, I don't think it's my strongest poem necessarily,
Mm,
but it is very much very important to me, and I
yeah.
wanted it to be there to demonstrate the kind of things that people will say to gaslight you, and to this coded speech
Yeah.
that people will use to make you think that they just have everyone's best interest at heart, and
Mhm.
I'm just a parent who's, and it's very sly, it's very
Yeah.
sly. But one of the things that I said was, you know you come down on the right side of history. This is the same conversation when we were talking about um water fountains and being, segregated water fountains and segregated bathrooms
Yeah,
and
it sure
all of
is.
those things. And there is a movie actually where I appear towards the very end at this school board meeting.
Hmm.
It's called The Most Dangerous Year. It was a documentary about the fight for who families of transgender youth and allies fighting against this bill. Um, and I wish they'd had a section kind of towards the later end of what I was saying, but it's kind of cool that I appear there. I didn't even know that was going to happen, but it's pretty cool.
Yeah. Well, poetry aside, because obviously that can be argued, but this poem deals with very important themes, and I think the dual themes, the showcasing of dog whistling and people who will mask their hate speech, um, with you know a smile.
Hmm.
It's very important, and then also the way that they try to contort what you know to be true and what you know to be reality, um, the reality of the ugliness behind their words,
Hmm.
which you call leaving pestilent sludge in the wake of your comments. You shed any pretense of compassion and goodwill. You know that there is sludge underneath those comments, and they try to
Hmm.
twist the narrative to make it seem like they're just concerned citizens. I think both of those things are really important and can be extricated for different topics,
Absolutely.
abusive partners, a whole flurry of things.
Yeah.
I think it's a really important poem.
Thank
Whether or
you.
not you find it to be one of your best, I think that it's really, really important and it's well done.
Thank you. Yeah, in my work, I want people to think because I think a lot of
Sure.
times it's so easy to hear a single story and just be like, "Oh yeah, that makes sense," without really thinking about, but wait a minute, it actually doesn't make sense. Let me think about this a little bit deeper.
Yeah.
So I try to offer the flip side sometimes, or things that people have had the luxury to not have to question.
Yeah. So on page 14, there's the poem Holding On. And I'm going to read the first four lines of it. You've placed the new dishes on the table already, centuries of holly weight, perched along the freshly ironed neutral zone of the runner, our only spectators. I'm curious what that means to you.
Hmm.
What were you thinking when you wrote it?
I was thinking of, um, in relationships, there are two people, and the version of events are often seen so differently from the
Mm,
one person to the other person, but we don't have spectators who are there to witness um, what's happening.
I see.
And also, it was Christmas time in my mind in this piece, and so I wanted centuries of holly wait. Um,
Mm,
and and also the niceties of, you're sitting down to a nice dinner, there's a runner on the table, there's the
dishes.
Christmas decorations,
Hmm.
there's the beautiful soup, and then there's often so much underlying there can be so much underlying turmoil uh,
Yeah,
in a relationship, or when there's tension, or both people could be going through different things and not um being able to be witness to each other.
yeah,
And so that was what I was thinking of. And then there's a line that says, "There's no way to know which version of you will appear from one dinner to the next. No way to know what shape this meal will take in tomorrow's reflection." And
yeah,
because again, both people are having two different experiences
yeah,
sometimes, and the way that it will show up in our memories can be very different
yeah.
too.
That's really interesting.
Yeah.
Wow. And a lot of we talked about this in the last interview, about being seen and what that
Hmm.
means. And this really takes on a whole different like existential side of that question. Because a lot of times when you write about being seen, it's like about not being seen in certain spaces as an educated black woman,
Hmm.
or not being seen as black if you speak in a certain vernacular,
Right.
or not being seen as educated if you speak in a black vernacular,
Absolutely.
or um, or African American vernacular, that is. So there's a lot of, or allies not seeing black pain. So many different ways that you bring up being seen, but this is one that is additional, and I didn't even notice it actually until you explained this. So that's really important. I love that you had a whole extra layer, and you do talk a lot about relationships throughout, which isn't something that we have really discussed much
Mhm.
in the last interview or in this interview. So if you have anything else to say about um, what made you put general relationship poems in this piece that seems to be primarily, to me at least, doing a lot of work to further the conversation about what specifically Black people are going through and
Mhm.
Black
Mhm.
women. What was your idea of placing general relationship poems in with the rest of the poems?
That's a great question. I think that oftentimes we are seen as having and furthering the narrative about, Black experience, and it has a very specific look to it. And I talk about being Black almost every day. There's
Sure.
something that comes up about being Black, about being a woman. Now that my brother is living here, we actually talk more about women and men and our experiences in
Yeah.
the world. Um, but also there are aspects of our relationships as Black people, as queer people, as um, whatever, are that look that anybody else could have written. Like
Yeah.
a white person could have written this,
Yeah.
a straight person,
Yeah.
whatever could have written this, and this actually does not refer to a romantic relationship.
Oh, wow.
It is at least in my mind, what I had in mind is this poem is a familial relationship.
Yeah.
But sometimes we aren't seeing, or the media, what is seen as Black media or whatever, like what you see during Black History Month, the movies, it doesn't necessarily just show us as people who have a family and who have complicated relationships with their family that don't have anything to do with our race. um
Yeah.
for queer people, we have things that are going on in our lives and relationships that don't have anything to do with being queer necessarily.
Right.
um and so there's this. But going back to something that we talked about in the first interview, I have had people who look at my poems that have like AAVE in it, or that are about that show activism, and say, oh, this is your real voice, this is what you should make sure to concentrate on.
Yeah,
And it's
you
like,
mentioned that.
but also I have real experiences like I'm talking about and holding on. That's just
Yeah.
a dinner, at Christmas time,
Yeah.
and it's a tricky family relationship.
Yeah. And in a way that does do something to further the conversation, because you're highlighting the humanity
Right.
of people. Because if you just go on Netflix and you look at everything that is about Black people, it's all about one specific really small microcosm of Black life, which will be, there'll be 20,000 things about police brutality,
Hmm.
and one
Black
thing,
trauma.
yes, and trauma and being imprisoned for something, and that's very real. But also, so is a difficult dinner with the family.
Right. For
you
sure.
know your Xbox won't turn on and you're annoyed, like just
Right.
small human things, and it's like,
Yeah.
where is that
Right.
in the
Like my new
conversation?
dog is very skittish, and
Yes.
I I forget, I ran to the store yesterday, and he was here with my siblings by himself, and he peed on the floor. And it's like,
Oh,
oh,
yeah.
and he peed on the floor,
Yeah.
like there's
Everybody can relate to certain moments, and that's important. um that's important.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
for sure.
we're more similar as humans than we are
Then we
different,
are different.
and it's important to have those connections,
Mhm.
because that's what most of life is. It's
Mhm.
missing the bus or making spaghetti.
Yeah. You know?
So I just
Absolutely.
have one more question because I
Okay.
gotta wrap up since it's so late here. Um, in on page 45, you write about the quiet shame of winter. I was wondering what you what you were thinking of when you wrote that.
Yeah, and I'll just read it really briefly.
Yes, it's really
It's
short.
a short one. Okay. The quiet shame of winter. Barren and bereft after being stripped of her bounty, the memory of her fullness, of her lavish conceit, spilling her beauty to be stepped on and spoiled, is all that remains inside of her. And it's all in lowercase. I'm
Yeah,
not I am not quite sure why I did that. I think because, it's the quiet shame. Like this is a piece that it doesn't take up a lot of room. And I think that sometimes we as individuals who when are in marginalized instances,
hmm,
or marginalized communities, excuse me, we often can find ourselves in places where we try to not take up room. And
sure.
sometimes that's just a moment and we're like, "No, I'm gonna take up as much," but there are moments when we try not to take up too much room, and that felt the title and the lowercase letters and the shortness of the brevity of the poem made me think of that. I think I heard that I had carried the phrase "the quiet shame of blank"
I see.
in my notebook for a long time, and one day I was actually looking at a tree, um, a deciduous tree that had lost its leaves for the winter. And I was thinking about women and
Mm,
how often we put on layers of things.
yeah,
Um, and then sometimes we're stripped of them. And that lavish conceit, that lavishness that we can put on or people can put on. And then when you are taken advantage of in whatever way,
yeah,
um, emotionally, physically, mentally, then it's like a part of you has just been sullied and and it's spoiled as well. And that the sometimes the memory of that, we hold on to the memory of that
yeah,
and we have to let it go. Like I think that things happen and you have to let those things go. There'll always be a part of you in a way, but that doesn't have to be the only thing that you hold inside. And if it is the only thing that you hold inside, then that breaks you down, I think.
yeah,
And there's so much loss because of that. There's like an additional loss of
yeah,
you, of the fullness of you when
yeah.
trauma takes away from you. And that's,
Eats away.
yeah, and it eats away at you.
That makes a lot of sense. I actually didn't even think about this when I wrote down The Quiet Shame of Winter specifically, but then I remembered that you also have one of your first poems in the collection is A Spade in Winter. And I realized actually just thinking about it like, oh, you actually use the word winter quite a few times.
Oh.
And then you talk about topics such as loss. And even loss in the womb, so like barrenness. And
Mm-hmm.
so if there's a motif of winter, um it really does play well. And I actually just did a quick search. You never use the word summer, you never use
Mm.
the words autumn or fall, you use the word spring once, but you use the word winter 8 different times
Wow.
in the entire collection. So and winter does seem to go best with the other themes.
Mm-hmm.
But I wasn't sure if that was intentional because going back to earlier in our conversation too, you have mentioned a few times, I think, how you were thinking about Christmas time when you were writing some of the poems.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm just noticing that winter is really just coming up. So I know I
Wow.
said this is the last question, but I just wanted to see if you had any additional thoughts about the relationship between the themes in the book and wintertime.
Wow, I'd love that you asked that question. I love these conversations because I feel like I learn more about the piece and what
Yeah,
comes out of it, and even when it's not intentional, it's like, yeah, that definitely could be a piece of it.
yeah.
Wintertime, I love winter, and
Hmm.
um I don't talk about this at all, but I have a sun allergy and
Yeah,
I
you do.
am much better. You know, I suffer less severely now,
Yeah,
than I have in the past, though summer and spring, actually more spring than summer, um, are very difficult times for me because of my reactions to the sun. Spring,
wow.
because it is starting to be light again, and that shift from I live in the Pacific Northwest, so that shift from the darkness, the overcastness, into what is more prevalent sun in the spring
Yeah,
is very hard for my skin and my body to acclimate to. Once we get into summertime, you know, it's so hot and also um well, it's so hot and I just stay in, you know, I'm often inside
yeah,
and it's not, and everybody is so happy in the spring because of the darkness, the overcastness and the
yeah,
rain, that everybody wants to do things outside. And so that's a hard time for me that I don't enjoy when a lot of people really super enjoy springtime and summertime. And so even though winter is often a time of being bereft and being in loss, and you know, trees are losing their leaves and all of that, and it's the heavy rain season here. Like, I moved here for the heavy rain season, for the
yeah,
grayness. I love it.
yeah.
And I really
Me
have a
too.
different viewpoint of it. And also the winter holidays. I know everybody doesn't celebrate Christmas, but the
Sure.
winter holidays, it's still a family time. It's time when a lot of people have time to travel and get together with their families. But there is that flip side to it of um loss
Yeah,
and of coldness, and so I'm not surprised that that came up because loss is a big theme of Brief Black Candles.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. That's well said. Well, if you don't have anything else, then I think that we will conclude here, and I think that we'll do one more interview in a couple more months.
All right.
All
Very
right.
good.
All
Thanks,
right.
Kaya.
You're welcome. Bye
It's good
bye.
to see you. Love you.
Love you too.
Bye.